Good day, grade 12 learners. Welcome to today's history lesson. My name is Mr. Dixon. This lesson is brought to you by the Gauteng Department of Education in collaboration with Saibono Discovery Center. Learners, today we are going to have an overview pertaining to paper 1. I hope you've got your pens and your paper ready so that we can start. Let's quickly go to what we call the examination instructions. It's pertinent, learners, that you must understand that paper 1 and paper 2, we are only dealing with paper 1 because you are writing it tomorrow basically. Paper 1 consists of section A, paper 2 consists of section A also. Paper 1 consists of section B, which is the essay part. Paper 2 also has got what we call section B, the essay part. But today we are only going to focus on paper 1. Let's go to section A. Section A, it is basically question 1. And what we are going to deal with is the Cold War, the origin of the Cold War. We will not go into detail pertaining to the origins, but we'll just highlight certain things that needs to guide you and it needs to assure what you need to do tomorrow basically. Question 2 is independent Africa. It's a case study of Angola. Then we move to question 3. Question 3 is the civil society protest from the 1950s to the 1970s. And it is basically the civil rights movement within the USA basically. So that will be the source-based questions. Now let's go to section B. Section B will be question 4. And the question type will be the extension of the Cold War. It's a case study with regards to Vietnam. We all know that question 4 is basically Vietnam. Then question 5 is what we call independent Africa. It's a case study of Angola as a country. Then question 6 is the civil society protest from the 1950s to the 1970s. And the topic that we're dealing with in question 6 is the Black Power movement basically. So there you have it, learners. We have section A, we have section B. Section A is the source-based part and section B is the essay part. Now let's go further into the instructions. And what we are going to deal with now is how you should answer and the amount of questions that you should answer basically. You need to answer 3 questions from the 6 that has been presented now to you. One must be a source-based and the other one must be a essay. Then the third question can either be a source-based or an essay. So what does that mean, learners? It means now you must answer 3 questions, 2 source, 1 essay, or 2 essays, 1 source. So now the question comes in, sir, can I start with my essay first? Yes, you can start with your essay first if you don't have the confidence that you will be remembering. But if you have the confidence, you start with your source first and then you start with your 2 essays afterwards. Then what we need to always know is that we need to answer 3 questions. So we advise you that you spend 1 hour per question because you're answering 3 questions. Remember now, tomorrow's question paper will be 3 hours long basically. So it's pertinent, learners, that we utilize 1 hour per question basically. Now let's quickly go into how we should answer our source-based questions basically. We need to understand, learners, that in the source-based part, we basically have what we call level 1. And level 1 questions are what we call extraction evidence from the sources. So it means now our answers were in the sources. So what do we have basically? We basically have what we call 12 marks, which is where? Which is in the source. Then we basically have 2 marks basically, which is our concepts that we need to have studied, that we need to have known. Then we have level 2 questions. Level 2 questions needs us to interpret the evidence from the different sources, explain information gathered from the sources, analyze evidence from the sources, and that will give us 20 marks basically. So the mark allocation for level 1 will be 14 basically. Then level 3 questions, it means we need to interpret, evaluate evidence from sources, engage with sources, and the type of level 3 questions that you will be confronted with tomorrow, learners, it will be how useful is the source, comment on the usefulness of the source, how reliable is the source, biasness of the sources, and the limitations. Then you will also be confronted with compare the two sources, the contradictions between the sources, and what you need to do there is you need to interpret it. And after interpret it, then we move over to the last part. The last part of level 3 questions are what we call a paragraph question per se, basically. Now, when we look at level 1 questions, we indicated that it is very important that it extracts information. So now we will understand that it extracts information from the sources. Two marks will be for the definitions or the concepts, and they carry a maximum mark of basically 3 times 1. Sometimes it will be 4 times 1. So it's important that we understand that will be the maximum marks for level 1 questions. Now they have question verbs. The question verbs are as follows: list, quote, identify, name, mention. That's what we call. So once you see list, quote, identify, name, mention, then you need to understand the answers are where in the sources, basically. Then we have typical level 1 questions, how the questions are being phrased, basically. For example, what information in the source tells you about. You need to quote from the different sources. What do you understand by the term in the context of this particular topic? But with level 1 questions, they would normally say, what do you understand by the term in your own words, then according to the source. Now this is how they would basically phrase level 1 questions. Level 2 questions, like I indicated earlier, you must be able to interpret, analyze, and engage the evidence from the sources. Then the question verbs are as follows. It is explain, comment, describe, organize. And once you see those words, then you need to understand that it is a level 2 question. But explain, I'm circling explain, I'm circling comment. So once you see explain and comment, then you need to understand that sometimes they would utilize explain and comment also for level 3 questions. For example, explain the usefulness, comment on the usefulness, explain how reliable is the source, comment on the reliability of the source. So explain and comment, it is basically used for level 2 and level 3 questions, but describe and organize is basically used for level 2 questions. Then what are the typical questions? So when we look at the typical questions, it means now how are they being phrased? What message does the cartoonist convey, or what message does the source convey? If it's a written source, explain in your own words. Why do you think according to the source in your own knowledge, basically? Now that's a typical level 2 question. Now let's look at a level 3, the typical level 3 questions that you will be confronted with. Level 3 questions require you to explain the different perspectives of sources. You must draw conclusions about how reliable is the source, how useful is the source, and also with regards to the limitation of the different sources. Now, these sources, they carry a maximum mark of 8 to 4 marks. Why 8? Because of the paragraph, and the rest of the other level 3 questions are always, as we can see on the screen as I'm circling it to you, 2 times 2 equals 4, basically, at the end of the day. Then what are the question verbs? Compare, contrast, comment, and like I said earlier, explain also. Explain to what extent the evidence in source 1a can be compared to evidence from 1b, basically. So you must comment, you must explain on the usefulness, how reliable, the limitations of the information, and then the paragraph question. Now this is just an overview. What is level 1, level 2, and level 3 questions? So level 1 questions, all the level 1 questions are in the source. Level 2 questions, you must engage the sources, you must be able to analyze and interpret it. And level 3 questions, it is basically also where you need to analyze and interpret those particular sources. Now learners, it is important that we understand that after reading our questions, we need to look at the mark allocation. Like you can see on the screen, the number 1 is circled in red. That means the amount of answers, the amount of responses you must provide. Then it says 1 times 2, it means one answer will be 2 marks. And when we go to the bottom one, it says you must provide 2 answers, but one answer will be 2 marks, and that will give you the 4 marks as per se. So here we have a clearer indication that the bottom number 2 is circles. So that means now the amount of marks per answer basically that you will receive. So if you see a mark allocation of 1 times 1, 2 times 1, 3 times 1, remember learners, those are extraction questions as per se. But when you see a mark allocation of 2 times 4, this is what we call, you must interpret it, you must analyze that particular question. It means you must have studied the content in order for you to be able to answer that particular question. Now, learners, very pertinent, very vital. Read the question, underline the keywords, and you go to the concepts. And the concepts will guide you how you should answer and the amount of responses you must provide. Now, remember now, there are different types of level 3 questions. You will be confronted with how do sources support each other. Then you will be confronted with how reliable the sources are, the usefulness, and the limitations as per se. Now let's go to how do you answer support. Now, the first thing is when they talk about support, it means similarities. How is source 1A the same as 1B? But now the question is, how do I answer it? As I'm underlining, how do I answer it? I write down the following. Source 1A says there are triple stories, and this is supported by 1B, which says there are triple stories. So now we can see triple stories in 1A, triple stories in 1B. That's how they support each other. Then you must go back to source 1A. Now you need to say, source 1A says there are buses. And this is supported by 1B, which informs us how the buses were utilized. So what is similar? Buses basically. Now, if we use the word buses in both sources, and then we say both sources informs us that buses were utilized at the end of the day. So we can't just say that both sources are talking about buses. We must say buses are utilized for this particular purpose in the two sources. Then that is with regards to support. Contrast means the opposite. So how do we answer? We say in 1A, now you must write it like this, learners. Source 1A says there are triple stories, and this is contradicted by 1B, which says there were single houses. So what is a contradiction? Triple stories and single houses. Now you go back to 1A, and what do you say? In 1A, it says they were utilizing guns. In 1B, they were indicating that they were using missiles. So what is the difference? Guns and missiles, although both of them are weapons at the end of the day, basically. Then you will be confronted with biasness, but all you need to do is you need to understand what is biasness. It's from one point of view, and it has got limitations pertaining to that particular topic. And you must also look at the motive, basically. Now, when you look at how reliable sources are, you must be able to ask two questions. Is it accurate? Can it be trusted? Now, that's not where you will find the answer. You will find the answer by the following 4 questions. I'm circling it for you in order for you to know exactly. Now, when you ask yourself, is it accurate? Can it be trusted? Now you ask yourself, who wrote it? So now you indicate this source was written by John van Niekerk. 2 marks. When was the source made? Now you indicate the date. You must not say that the date corresponds with the event. You must indicate that the source was written on 13 July 1961. Then why was it created? Is the evidence in the source consistent with evidence from other sources, basically? So now we can clearly see, learners, that by answering these 4 questions, that's where your answers will come from, basically. So you need to read the source thoroughly in order for you to answer the source at the same time also. So when we look at usefulness, it's almost answered in the same way. But now remember, how reliable is the source will be asked. Comment and explain. Usefulness will also be asked. Explain and comment the usefulness of the source. So how do we answer it? We look basically again at the 4 questions being asked. Is it accurate? That's got to do with the date now. Is it accurate? does it give the correct information that really happened during that particular event? Does it mean what it says? Can it be corroborated? Corroborated means, is it in line what the other sources are saying? Does it say the same thing at the end of the day? Now, in order to answer this, can it be corroborated? We need to say source A and B corroborates with source 1D, which is maybe the source that we are dealing with at this particular point of view. Then it's important, learners, that we always focus on the message of the source. The minute we focus on the message of the source, now we can ask these 4 questions, and that's where your answers basically come from. Then you will be confronted also with limitations. Now, limitations, boys and girls, it is quite easy to answer, because now you need to first look at the quality of the source. Where does the source come from? Is there a date? So if there's no date, now you indicate the source is limited because there's no date. The source is limited because there is no author being indicated, basically. Then you will have to look at the following, basically. Is the source biased? Is the source reliable? Can the source be trusted? So now you indicate the source is biased because it gives one point of view. So now I have given you 3 examples. If there's no date, now you indicate there's no date, that's 2 marks. You indicate there's no author. You indicate there is no indication where the source was derived from. That's already 3. Then the last one is the source is biased because it only gives one point of view from this particular country or this particular individual at the same time, basically. And then also, lastly, is the source consistent with the other sources also? So I've just mentioned to you how you should answer the level 3 questions. Now, level 3 questions continues into the paragraph. Now, remember, the paragraph is worth 8 marks. They use what we call a holistic rubric, and the question is phrased at the level 3 level, basically. And how do they phrase this question? Explain the role, the impact, the causes or effects or significance of a particular historical event. And it is always pertinent, learners, that our paragraph is the key question. So when we answer 1A, very important that we understand. When we answer 1A, when we answer 1B, 1C, 1D, we need to underline what's answering the key question. And where do we find the key question? You find the key question on top, and then it's written either question 1, question 2, or question 3 as per se, basically. Now, learners, we have dealt with how you should answer source-based questions. Let's quickly go into the content of the origin of the Cold War. We'll be dealing with question 3 also, and we'll be doing an overview, but we'll be doing some sources in between just for you to have a better understanding. Let us just briefly explain the content. End of the Second World War, that is where it basically starts. The origin of the Cold War officially starts at the end of the Cold War, meaning 1945. Why did the Cold War develop, basically? It's pertinent that we understand that 3 conferences were held, basically. The first conference, the Iran, 1943. There, the big 3, as we can see here, the big 3. This one is Winston Churchill, this one is Roosevelt, and this one is Stalin, basically. Roosevelt is Great Britain, Churchill, USA, Stalin, USSR, basically. So now we can clearly see that the big 3 met at Tehran in 1943. There, Churchill and Roosevelt, in conjunction with Stalin, agreed that Stalin will restore the Eastern European countries that would later be called the Iron Curtain, the satellite states of USSR. And Stalin also indicated that you will not turn these countries into communist countries. Then they met again in 1945 at what we call at the Yalta Conference. Yalta Conference, it was agreed upon that Germany will be divided into 4 zones: British, French, USA, and Soviet zone. Also, it was indicated that the capital Berlin will be divided into 4 zones. Now, it's pertinent we understand why did they divide the capital into 4 zones. If you understand politics, you rule the capital, you rule the country. So the capitalist side did not want USSR, which was communist, to rule the country as per se. And this is why Berlin, the capital, was divided into 4 zones. But later, the 4 zones was divided up into West Berlin, the 3 capitalist countries, Great Britain, USA, and France. And then on the eastern side, it was only the Soviet Union, basically. Even the country, Germany, was divided also in West Germany and East Germany also. Then what happened afterwards is that the USA provided what we call containment policies. The Truman Doctrine, they provided military aid and financial aid to countries not to fall prey to communism. Then they also provided what we call the Marshall Plan. So it's pertinent that we understand that they provided the containment policies, which is Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, and thus now the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan actually created now basically what we call the Cold War now, because what happened is the Soviet Union also had 2 policies. Cominform, it means communist information, and at the same time it was communist information was basically finding out which countries wants to fall prey to capitalism. And then the other policy was what we call Molotov. So Molotov was similar to the Marshall Plan provided for Eastern European countries, because the Marshall Plan was made available for all European countries. But the Molotov Plan was made available only for the Eastern European countries, and they had to pay it back at a certain time with a certain amount of percentage as per se. But within Berlin itself, there were 2 crises, one in 1949. The one in 1949 is where Stalin blocked off all routes. Take note now, the Cold War is in full swing now because of the policies that was introduced. The policies was a way of fighting off capitalism and fighting off communism at the same time. So the Berlin crisis in 1949, because remember now, Stalin is not happy because Berlin is in the heart of the Soviet zone and it's being divided into 4 zones basically. So what transpired is that within Berlin, on the western side of Berlin, it was a capitalist side. So Stalin blocked off all routes leading from West Germany into West Berlin. So it means roads were closed, canals were closed, rivers were closed, and that basically lasted for 11 months. And at the end of the 11 months, it was estimated that more than 200,000 flights were taken during that time, where they were dropping off basic necessities for the people in West Berlin. And that was the first crisis. So after 11 months, Stalin stopped and he opened up all the roads. Then the other Berlin crisis was basically in 1961. So in 1961, basically, what transpired is Nikita Khrushchev became the new leader after the death of Stalin in the late 1950s. Then what transpired is Nikita Khrushchev built a wall separating now West Berlin from East Berlin. Now, why did he do that? He did it because more than 3,000 people in a week moved from East Berlin to West Berlin just to get a better life with regards to capitalism. So they regarded capitalism as a prosperity, meaning improving the lives of an individual as such. But then the 2 sides, the capitalist side, which was now basically the leader of the capitalist side was the USA, and the leader of the communist side, it was basically USSR. So on the capitalist side, they created what we call a military wing, NATO. On the Soviet side, the communist side, they created a military wing called Warsaw Pact, basically. And these were the 2 military wings that were protecting these countries, basically. Now, take note that capitalism was instituted into different countries. So NATO protected those countries. Warsaw Pact basically protected the communist countries, and all the countries that were part of the communists, they formed part of Warsaw Pact. All the countries that was part of NATO, they formed part of NATO as per such. Then also, who was to blame for the Cold War? The USA blamed the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union blamed the USA. So there was no clear indication who was actually to blame. At the end of the day, it was a result of both of them caused the Cold War. Now remember, the Cold War is a war of words, meaning capitalism against communism, but no physical contact is being made there. Now let's look at the source quickly. Source, it says question 1, source 1b. Let me read the caption, then I'll go into the source. The source below is from a book titled The Great Power Conflict After 1945 by P. Fisher, who was a historian. It details the accounts of Police Sergeant Hans Peters and hotel worker Ursula Hennemann, who were eyewitnesses to the events that took place in Berlin on 13 August 1961. Hans Peters was on border duty in the French sector. Now remember what I said, Berlin was divided into 4 sectors: USA, Great Britain, and the French side, basically. Then what transpired on the French sector of West Berlin at 2:20 a.m. 6 trucks rode towards him, highlights blazing, 8 yards, 1 yard equals to 0.914 meters away from them, stopped. A moment later, the street was full of armed soldiers who set up machine guns aimed at the French sector. 2 guards approached carrying rolls of barbed wire at the invisible borderline between the Soviet and the French sector. The squads cordoned off, blocked the street. In the houses, no one moved basically. At 4:45 a.m., Ursula Hennemann awoke in an East Berlin flat to another working day at the Plaza Hotel in West Berlin. She walked to the nearby station and went to the ticket counter. No. Now take your pennies, money back. It's all over now with trips to Berlin. At that moment, Ursula saw 5 armed East German transport police heading her way. She turned and ran back to her flat. They've closed the border. In a moment, the landing and the corridors of the flats were full of people shouting and crying. She decided that she must cross to the west. But how? Near the United States sector, she slipped, approaching through an orchard planting and reached the skin at least. She reached a border post. A moment later, she was in West Berlin. By early morning, East German police and soldiers had cut the city in two. The seal-off operation went on. Only a few crossing points stayed open, protected by tanks, armored cars, and water cannons. Nevertheless, some were still determined to risk that by crossing from east to west. Now let's go into the questions quickly. And this is the first question, 2.1.1. Identify 3 incidents in the source that Hans Peters witnessed at 2:20 a.m., 13 August 1961, while he was on duty in the French sector of West Berlin. Now let's look at the answer. Remember, this is now a level 1 question. 6 trucks rode towards him. That is 1 answer. Remember, we need 3 answers. 3 is the answer that we need. 8 yards, 1 yard. 80 yards, 1 yard equals 0.914 meters away. They stopped. Another mark. The street was full of armored vehicles who set up machine guns aimed at the French sector. Another mark. 2 guards approached carrying coils of barbed wire. Another mark. The squads cordoned off the streets, the houses, no one moved. So now we can clearly see. It says you identify 3 incidents that Hans Peters witnessed. So these were the now the 6 things that he witnessed, but we only need 3 answers. So if you provided the first 3, you're 100% correct. Now let's go to the next question, 1.2.2. Comment on what is implied by the words, "It's all over now with the trips to Berlin," in the context of what happened on 13 August 1961. Now let's look at the answer. Basically, it's a level 2 answer. The first question was a level 1, extraction. So now we're moving over to level 2. It means you must interpret, you must be able to evaluate. What must you interpret? It's all over now with trips to Berlin. What did he mean by that? It means you must interpret in the context of the topic that you're dealing with, basically. So the first answer is the border between East and West Berlin, it was closed. That you give yourself 2 marks. There was no longer any free movement to and from East and West Berlin. People were trapped on either side, another 2 marks. The Iron Curtain, Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States had intensified tension as the border was now closed, another 2 marks. So from the 3 answers provided, you can basically decide which 3 you want to write down. But this is a clear indication the type of question that you will be confronted. But you must be able to, here you need to be able to read in between the lines. When we say in between the lines, you must be able to interpret and analyze it. Now let's look at the level 3 question quickly. 1.2.3, explain why a historian would regard this source as reliable when researching an account of what transpired on the morning of 13 August 1961, basically. It's a reliable, it says as the source is reliable. Then what do we need to explain? What transpired when? In the morning of 13 August. So we need to go to the source, we need to retrieve, and we need to analyze and interpret it. So how do we answer? Remember now, there were 4 questions that we had to answer, and that is basically our answer. Now let's look at the first answer provided. It was taken from a book, The Great Power Conflict After 1945. It means the historian is being mentioned here. It was based on the eyewitness account of Police Sergeant Hans Peters or hotel worker Ursula Heinemann. So this is giving us a description of what transpired, basically. The eyewitness account, basically, it relates to the actual date. You see here the date is being mentioned. Very important, learners, that you must mention the date. If the date is not mentioned, 0 marks for you, basically. Then the accounts can be corroborated by, we see corroborated. Now, this is how you should answer, basically. It corroborated means it relates, it is the same, like in 1A and 1C and 1D regarding the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, and it affects on people and the movement of the people as per se. Now let's move quickly to our next question, which is a paragraph 1. Using the information in the relevant source and your own knowledge, write the paragraph of about 8 lines explaining why the United States of America gave financial aid to European countries after 1945. Now remember now, the answer that you see on the screen, it's basically in bullet format. Now, if you provide it in bullet format in your answer book tomorrow, you will only get 2 marks. You will not get more than that. So the bullet form that is being provided here, it's just basically for display purposes so that you can have an understanding where we found this information. But remember, the paragraph question, the questions needs to flow into each other, basically, and that's what we call a paragraph. Well, what you see on the screen is not a paragraph, it's called bullet form. So bullet form, 2 marks. Remember, it's out of 8 marks. Let's go to the first answer. For humanitarian reasons in the context of post or crisis, source 1A, to prevent the spread of communism in Europe. From source 1A, to promote the economy recovery of Europe after the Second World War. Sources 1A to 1D, to gain political control over Europe. Sources 1B, 1C. To soften the expected post-war economic crisis in the USA. Source 1B, 1D. To benefit the capitalist economic system, a monopoly capital. Source 1B and 1D, to promote US dollar diplomacy, imperialism. Source 1B and C, to reduce the threat of unemployment within the USA. 1D, to establish a sphere of influence in Europe. Own knowledge. Any other relevant responses related to the question being asked. So now you can see, once you have this information and it is in the format of a paragraph, then you will receive your full 8 marks. Now let's move over to the next topic. Question 3, the civil rights movement in the USA. Let's go to the overview quickly. The overview is what guides us. It's examination bullets, what the question will be focusing on more or less. The reasons and origins of the civil rights movement in the USA, the role and impact and influence of Martin Luther King Jr. Let's stop there. Let's look at the reasons. Why did the civil rights movement start? First of all, it started off because of the Rosa Parks incident. There, Martin Luther King became the leader. So the role, he became the leader of the civil rights movement after the Rosa Parks incident, basically. And when we look at bullet 3, it speaks about the forms of protest through civil obedience. So the Montgomery bus boycott was of the result of the Rosa Parks internet was arrested because she was sitting in a white area within the bus. And for that reason, she was arrested. And after being arrested, Martin Luther King was the leader, and they did not utilize the buses in Montgomery for about 13 months. And that was a major victory because the African Americans did not travel with the buses anymore. They walked to work, they cycled to work, or they had lift clubs basically at the end of the day. And that was what we call the Montgomery bus boycott. So that was the first victory because the bus owners lost a revenue between 65-75%, and they realized it was not good for business at the end of the day. Then the second form of protest was the sit-ins. So the sit-ins basically, boys and girls, 4 African Americans went to a Woolworths lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, refused service the first day. The next day, they returned with more people. And it didn't only stop at Woolworths lunch counter, it spread to libraries, it spread to the beaches, it spread to the movies. So it spread to different public places. And that was also a success because businesses and public areas were desegregated at the end of the day, basically. Now, so it is important that we understand that as they were integrated, it is clear that the sit-ins was a major success at the same time. Then after the sit-ins, it was basically what we call, take note learners, it was basically what we call the freedom rides. So the freedom rides, 13 multiracial students from the north traveled to the south. And as they travel from the north to the south, learners, it is pertinent that we understand when they came to Alabama, the state of Alabama, one of the buses was set alight. And these 13 multiracial students were sitting mixed in the bus. Whites were sitting with blacks, blacks were sitting with whites, basically. And as the bus was set alight, it was live on television. And as it was live on television, more people began to join, and they also had freedom rides in different buses in the different areas. Then after that, it was the Birmingham campaign. So the Birmingham campaign, Birmingham was the capital of the races, basically, of the Ku Klux Klan and the white race supremacists, basically. So Martin Luther King came. The sit-ins, the freedom rides, Martin Luther King supported him from a distance, but Birmingham campaign was involved. They trained the protesters how to satyagraha. Now, satyagraha means to protest not to have a civil protest, but it is non-violent at the end of the day, basically. And this was also a success because Martin Luther King was arrested. A multitude of children were arrested at the same time also. And as children were arrested, Martin Luther King were arrested, it was basically there where he started writing. And what transpired is the businesses realized that, listen here, these boycotts that is transpiring, this protest is not good for business because they lost already a lot of revenue, and businesses desegregated within Birmingham, within itself. Then the Lincoln Memorial March, famous. Why? To celebrate 100 years of freedom from slavery and for jobs, basically. Then, but it turned afterwards, as Martin Luther came and made his famous speech, "I have a dream," basically. So after his speech, President Kennedy indicated that from Birmingham, he clearly indicated that racism is a moral issue, basically. And he said, we will introduce what we call the Civil Rights Act, basically. And so in 1964, it was introduced, but it was only signed, it was introduced in 1963, but 1964 it was signed off by Lyndon Johnson and Martin Luther King. Then after that was signed off, African Americans still had to write what we call a literacy test. And because they had to write what was called literacy test, Martin Luther King was not at the first march on, take note learners, on the 7th of March 1965. They came to a bridge called Edmund Bridge, and at that point in time, the marches were basically led by Reverend Lewis. They were asked by the paratroopers to return. The paratroopers are the police in the USA. The crowd did not return. It was a multiracial crowd. They were beaten up, and it was classified as Bloody Sunday. 9th March, 2 days after that, Martin Luther King came also with a group of more than 2,000 people, came to the same bridge, the Edmund Bridge, were asked to turn back. Martin Luther King encouraged the people, let's turn back because the police doesn't want us to continue. 19 March, they went to now to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled 21st March that the march is legal, basically. So they marched from Selma to Montgomery, which was about 80 kilometers. And at the end there, President Lyndon Johnson signed off what we call the Voters' Right Act, basically. So this is what we call the short-term and the long-term gains, basically, of the civil rights movement. Now let's go quickly into more detail with the civil rights movement. Very important, 1955 was not the start of the civil rights, but the school segregation of the Linda Brown issue, where Linda Brown wanted to attend a school nearby. She was refused. Her parents went to the Supreme Court. Now this was the first victory for African Americans. So the civil rights actually started in 1955 with the Rosa Parks incident. We can clearly see on the screen. Then 1956, Martin Luther King's house was bombed. The bus boycott ended after 13 months, basically. In 1957, the Little Rock also school desegregation. We're not going to touch that now. 1960, the student Christian Coordination Committee was founded, basically. So this clearly indicates that they were non-violent at the end of the day. Then the Greensboro sit-in was also 1960, the 4 students. Then 1961, it was the Freedom Rides, basically the 13 multiracial students. Then it was 1963, I Have a Dream speech. Then the Children's Crusade. Then also the Birmingham church bombing, basically. So the Birmingham campaign also happened in 1963. Then King was awarded a Nobel Prize for trying to maintain the peace of his nonviolent approach. 1965 was the Selma Montgomery March, and the Voters' Rights Act was signed, basically. Then we will basically see that the Civil Rights Act was passed also in 1968, and Martin Luther King was shot dead 1968, basically. Now let's look quickly at this source that we see on the screen. Source 3C, the photograph below is from a book titled The Day They March by D.E. Saunders. It shows civil rights marches on the way to Washington. This is the march now from in Washington, where they were marching from a particular place to the Lincoln Memorial statue, carrying placards during the march on Washington on 28 August 1963. Let's look at the march, at some posters. Let's go to the first one here. The first one here says, "No dough to help Jim Crow." Now, what was Jim Crow? Jim Crow were basically segregation laws in the southern states. Yes, segregation laws is what we call apartheid in South Africa. Then we go to the next one here. We demand voting rights. Then we go to the next one. We demand an end to police brutality. Then we go to the next one. We march for jobs for all now. We march for a higher minimum wages, average coverage for all workers now. We march for integrity. We march for integrated schools now, basically. And this is what the poster was all about. Now let's go to the questions being posed for question 3. State any 2 demands in the source that were made by the marchers who participated in the march on Washington on 28 August 1963. Let's look at the mark allocation, 2 marks and 1 mark each, basically, at the end of. Let's look at the answers provided. There are basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 answers. So the first answer says we demand an end to police brutality. Now remember, now this is a level 1 question. So the answers are where? In the source. So the word state, any 2 demands, those are the key words, and those key words will be in the source, and it will guide you how you should answer this particular question. So we demand an end to police brutality now. Now this was on the posters, basically. We march for jobs for all now. We march for integrated schools now. We demand voting rights now. We march for higher minimum wages coverage for all workers now. We use no U.S. dough to help Jim Crow. laws, basically. Now let's go to the next question. Why do you think the photographer decided to take this particular picture? Now look at the mark allocation. It is 2 answers, 2 marks per answer, basically. Now let's go to the answers. It says there, interpretation of evidence, level 2. It was to show the demands that African Americans were making for the civil rights, to show that males and females were marching, to show that the march was peaceful, basically non-violent, to show that both black and white Americans ended the march on Washington, to show the large number of people who marched to Washington and listened to Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, to show the determination of African Americans towards achieving equal rights. So there we can clearly see, learners, this is 2 marks, 2 marks, and as we go along, we can decide which one we want. But this is all what we call interpretation, because you must interpret the photo. And the question is, why do you think the photographer decided to take this photograph, basically? So you must now indicate why he decided to take this, basically. Like it says here, to show the demands. Now the demands, it was basically on the posters that was displayed. Now we are done now, basically, what we call the source-based questions. Let's quickly go into the essay part of tomorrow's paper, basically. Remember that every essay requires that learners must first take a stance, then they must develop a relevant line of argument at the end of the end. The line of argument must be coherent, basically. So the line of argument must be supported with real relevant historical information, basically. And this information must be organized in a connected chronological order that's answering the question being posed. Now, very important, the essay questions are asked in 3 ways, basically. Remember, it's question 4, 5, and 6. It's asked in 3 ways. It is not in no chronological order. It is just giving us a random indication how these questions will be posed for you tomorrow, basically. So critical discuss. The line of argument is one can approve, it can be approved upon, or indeed it can be approved, or indeed it can be disapproved. Do you agree with the above statement? One can agree, one can disagree, or it can be agreed upon. Take note, I'm not using I because we're historians. We always need to have a neutral stance when we start our stance. Then explain to what extent. So these are the 3 ways how they will be asked, and this is how you start your stance, to a less or to a greater extent, basically. Then we move over to the introduction. The first part of the introduction is what is the direct response to the question. The second one is the reason why you decided to take that stance. Then the line of argument that is going to be followed. It means what are you going to write about, basically. Then we move deeper into the introduction. Step 1, stance, refer to the question, basically. So we take our stance where we refer to the question. So we can say one can agree, one can disagree. It can be agreed upon that Martin Luther King, that Malcolm X contributed to the well-being of African Americans. Full stop, because that is the statement that is being provided. Remember now, when we go back basically to the 3 ways of questions, when it's critically discussed, do you agree? They always give us the statement. Very important. They always give us the statement, basically. Then the question follows. Explain to what extent. They start off explaining to what extent, and they give the statement, basically, how we should answer it. So when it comes now to the introduction, remember now, you've taken your stance, your first sentence, then you go to what we call the reason. So the reason, you take 2 examples from the content, and then you put it down. Then step 3 is orientation. Now you will indicate what you are going to write about. So after you have written the introduction, you just write 1 paragraph pertaining to the background, because the background creates the basis for the content. So the content is basically what we call the body. So how should your body look like? Remember now, your body is not 1 paragraph. Your body can be basically 6 to 15 paragraphs, basically. I'm just saying 15, it can be less than it, but not 1 paragraph, basically. Then take note, it also says with the essay, it must be 3 pages long. Now take note, some learners write small, others write big. So if you write small, you might be writing 2 3/4 of a page, but all the facts must be there. You must have maintained a line of argument. I will be explaining the line of argument now to you. Then at the same time, learners, others write big. So others might be writing, instead of now 8 pages, they might be writing 15 pages basically because of the size they are writing. So 3 is basically just saying, listen, you can't write less than 3 basically. So 3 is the minimum pages you are supposed to write. Then when we move to the body, take note, there must be relevant information and it must be connected to the line of argument, and it must be structured well, and it must be in a chronological order. It means 1 2 3 4. So it cannot start with 4, then 5, then 9, then no. It must be in a chronological order of the events basically, and you must reinforce it with a example. Now the P method, basically, the P means opening sentence of your paragraph must make clear why you took that particular statement, or when it comes down to the content, you make a point and you provide a statement, then you must explain it afterwards, then you must give evidence. And now the evidence sometimes is not one, it's maybe 2 or 3. Then you link it back. You either link it back to your introduction, the stance you took, or you link it back to the next paragraph, basically. Now let's move over to question 4, which is the extension of the Cold War of Vietnam. Let's read the question quickly. How was a small country like Vietnam able to win a war against the USA? Now let's look at the content, what you should know within the Vietnam essay. First of all, you must understand from 1957 to 1965. From 1957 onwards, it's basically where the content begins to start. So what transpired from 1957 to 1965? There was a struggle in Vietnam between South Vietnamese army and the communist rebel group called Vietcong, basically. So the Vietcong, they were supported by North Vietnam because North Vietnam was a communist country. Now, why was Vietnam divided into North and South? Because at the Geneva Conference 1954, Vietnam was divided into North and South. Now you explain, North communist country, South capitalist country. Now that paragraph is what we call background now, because the content only starts 1957 basically. Then we move to the next paragraph. Now we indicate how the USA now came, and they provided military aid and military advisors, and they provided finances at the same time also. And Kennedy introduced the Safety Village Act, which was not successful because it was to divide the Vietcong from the peasants, basically. But because the Vietcong were the peasants, so it was not successful at the end of the day. Then the war continues, 1965 to 1969, North Vietnamese US struggle. So now we introduced Lyndon Johnson, became president after Kennedy was assassinated. He introduced what we call Operation Range Hand, which was Operation Rolling Thunder, bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was not successful because the tunnels were underground also. And they dropped more bombs than in World War II, but still it was not successful, and it didn't stop the flow of the North Vietnamese army basically to support the Vietcong as per se also. We need to also mention that Vietcong, they were supported, Vietcong and the Viet Minh. Viet Minh was the army from North Vietnam. They were supported by the Chinese and the Soviet Union because they were the leaders. At that point in time, the USA were the leaders of the communist world, basically. Then we continue basically with the war from a Vietnamese and a USA perspective. After Operation Range Hand, where they introduced Operation Rolling Thunder, they also had what we call the spraying of chemical gases like napalm, gas agent orange. Basically, it was sprayed on the forestry to unravel the leaves, to uncover where the enemy was hiding, basically, because the enemy did not use normal soldier clothes at the end of the day. Now that created hatred in the hearts of the people because the plants and the vegetation, it was destroyed. So it means infrastructure was not the way it's supposed to be, and it also brought inappropriate growth in the fetus within particular babies. So it means up until today, a lot of people are impacted because of the gases that were sprayed. Then we move over to what we call the Tet offense. Why Tet offense? It was a religious festival indicating the end of the old year, the start of the new year, basically. And the VETCON made use of that opportunity by hiding the weapons in the coffins, because suddenly there was a huge amount of coffins during that point in time. And as there was a huge amount of coffins, they were hiding the weapons in there, and they captured 80% of South Vietnamese towns. And they also captured the U.S. embassy for a few hours, but the U.S. soldiers went and they defeat them and they drove them out, and some of the VETCON were basically killed there. So so we are still dealing with a war between Vietnam and the USA. Basically, the USA soldiers were inexperienced, they were not used to the climate, to the conditions, and they found it difficult to actually fight off the VETCON. And the VETCON used a tactic called hit and run, and they used booby traps at the same time also. And the way the VETCON fought against the US soldiers, it was a bit frightening towards them. And it created fear within their hearts, basically. And this is why a lot of the US soldiers turned to drugs, basically. And this is where they discovered now the plant opium. And we will not talk about the plant opium in detail, but the USA soldiers were basically in a struggling mode. Then what happened is the USA soldiers went on a search and destroy mission. So they went to the one village, My Lai village, and they killed more than 300 innocent women and children. It was the US public turned their view on the war, including Congress also, because it was live on. It was the first war that was live on television as per se. Students began to rise up within the USA. At Kent University, 4 students were killed and others were basically injured. So that was the indication how they turned against the war, including the Black Panther Party that turned also against the war within Vietnam. At the same time, take note, Johnson did not continue as president of the USA. Then Nixon became president, and he introduced now the withdrawal of the USA soldiers from Vietnam, basically. Now, take note, learners, after he indicated that you will introduce what we call Vietnamization. The US soldiers must train the ARVN, which were the soldiers of South Vietnam, to fight off the VETCON, but it was not a success. Although he introduced Vietnamization, Nixon, he was bombing Cambodia, Laos, the neighboring countries, and North Vietnam at the same time. So 1973, there was a ceasefire, but after 1976, most of the USA, about 90% of the USA soldiers were out of Vietnam. Why 90? Other 10 soldiers were maybe held captive. Others could not go with the ships, with the planes that was there. And what transpired is 1976, Vietnam became a unified communist country. Question remains, did the USA win or lose this war? After I've given you this information, so I've given you actually the topic, but you must create the appeal method based upon the topic that's being asked, basically. Let's go to Black Power movement. Now, within the Black Power movement, we will deal with the content. At the same time, we will look at the introduction and the conclusion of a particular essay. Now, let's look at the question being posed. Explain to what extent Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael were successful in instilling black pride among African Americans in the 1960s. Use relevant examples to support your answer. Now, let's go to the introduction that is being provided here. To a great extent, now we can see the stance is being taken. To a great extent, Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael were successful in instilling what? Black pride amongst African Americans in the 1960s. Now let's go back to the question being posed. It says explain to what extent. So we said to a great extent. Then we wrote Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael. Now you can see, learners, that we took the statement that was provided, and that became our stance. But we took the stance. The stance was to a great extent? Because the question is to what extent. Critically discuss it. Indeed, we can approve. Indeed, we can disapprove. Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, one can agree, Stokely Carmichael. So now we can clearly see that this part here is what we call the introduction. Then let's go to the second part in green. It says both emphasize racial pride, economic empowerment, and the creation of political and cultural institutions, basically. Now that's from the content, basically. Then we go to what we call, this is now the reason. So I'm just writing it down in order for you to see what is happening, basically, how you should construct a proper introduction. Then we go to the orientation. The following paragraphs will be explaining how Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael instilled black pride in African Americans, and that is our orientation, basically. Now we go to the background paragraph, learners, not more than one, because we're interested in the content. And remember now, when the paragraph is answering, basically, the question being asked, now you must argue that by using the Peel method. The point is being made, you must explain the point, and when you explain the point, now you indicate, I make this point because of this and this and that. Then you give an example, then you link it back. Now the link it back is you need to indicate how it's linking to the introduction, or it's linking to the next paragraph, basically at the end of the day. Now let's go to the overview. Now I've given you the question, I've given you introduction. So now let's go to the overview, basically. Reasons for the Black Power movement. Why did it start? Because the civil rights movement was too slow. African American population lived too far from the work employment, inadequate housing, inadequate transport, basically a high baby mortality rate. So those are the reasons why the Black Power, but very important, the civil rights movement was too slow to bring change for African Americans. But then I gave other reasons also to that also. Then formation of Black Panther Party, Nation of Islam. So before we start that, it is important that basically the role of Stokely Carmichael comes before this. Why? Why does the role of Stokely Carmichael comes before the formation of Black Panther Party? Because remember now, Stokely Carmichael was one of the leaders of the civil rights movement, and because he was one of the leaders of the civil rights movement, it is pertinent, it is important that we understand that him and Martin Luther King, after James Meredith was shot at, they completed the march. Stokely Carmichael was arrested. Then after his release, he said something, it's time for Black Power now. So he was basically the front runner with the initiation of the Black Power movement. Now take note, the Black Power was a movement, not a political party, not an organization. Then, because of him using the word, it's time for Black Power now, the Black Panther Party was started. And when the Black Panther Party was started, it was started by Surley and Huey, basically. Now those were the two gentlemen, Surley and Huey, Bobby Huey. They started the Black Panther Party. When that was basically started, so the Black Panther Party was started to defend African Americans against police brutality and the white racists. Then Stokely Carmichael joined the Black Panther Party now, meaning now he came with the idea of Black Power, but he joined the Black Panther Party. And the Black Panther Party basically had a 10-point system. For example, before and after care facilities, they had feeding schemes in the different communities. They wanted to create their own institutions, basically own universities, own banks, basically. And they were against the war within Vietnam also. They believe it was not an African-American fight, but a white fight, basically a capitalist fight. And they wanted socialism to be introduced in the US. And because of that, the FBI had close surveillance on the Black Panther Party and created chaos within the Black Panther Party, with infighting, basically. Then the Nation of Islam must be explained now. Elijah Muhammad started the Nation of Islam. It was not such a big organization as yet when it got started. Malcolm X was called Malcolm Little. He went to prison. In prison, he converted from Christianity to Islam. after joining Nation of Islam in prison, came out, became part of the leadership of Nation of Islam, became the most profound speaker within the Nation of Islam. And he, because of his profound eloquency, he hated white people, basically. He indicated that Martin Luther King is shaking hands with the enemy, and he did not like that relationship. And he indicated also that for black people to have changed, they must use aggression. So Malcolm X brought the part, and Stokely Carmichael brought the part. The Black Panther brought the part where aggression were used now. Now take note: civil rights, non-violent; black power, violent. But Malcolm's X view changed when he went to Mecca. At Mecca, he saw whites and black people working together. Came back from his pilgrimage in Mecca. Then he said to the Nation of Islam, let's change, let's begin to work with the white man, let's join Martin Luther King because he's on the right path. Then what transpired? He was expelled, started his own organization, assassinated. Then what happened is we are looking now at the short-term and long-term gains. But before we do that, we need to mention one or two other role players like Angela Davis, basically, that was part and parcel, and other leaders within the Black Panther Party as per se also. Then what transpired is that there was riots in the northern part of America, in Los Angeles for basically 4 summers. It means for 4 years, basically, there were riots. When Lyndon Johnson sent out a commission, the commission discovered it was because of inadequate housing, inadequate schools. African Americans were basically hired last, fired first, basically. And he sent certain people to organize and to restructure that. So everything changed because of the riot that actually broke up. And there is now the long-term gains and the short-term gains at the same time also, where the long-term gains are basically where they believe that black is beautiful, do not use straightener to straighten your hair. So that is pertinent, learners, that we understand that what I've mentioned now is the content of the Black Power movement, but you must be able to argue that by using the Peel method. So you must look at the question, and when the question is being answered in a paragraph, you can't just write it down as is. You must argue that point by indicating why it's relating back to the question as per se. Now let's go to the conclusion before we end off. So now we need to remember what we said in the introduction, because remember now the question is, how did Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael instill black pride in African Americans? So when we look at the conclusion, it says we need to indicate we are ending in conclusion by ending, by tying up. And we have mentioned to a great extent in the conclusion also. So let me read quickly. In conclusion, to a great extent, Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael instilled black pride in African Americans in the 1960s. So what changed here in conclusion? Because in the introduction, it's not conclusion, it's only to a great extent, basically. Then we move over to the reasoning. So the reason is the same basically that was in the introduction. It emphasized racial pride, economic empowerment, and the creation of political and cultural institutions. Then we have a last sentence indicating how we are ending this thing off. They created an African American into belief that they need to be proud to be black, basically. So learners, so now I have dealt basically with 4 questions. 2 source-based questions and 2 essay questions. So from the 4 questions, you must answer 3 questions. Remember, 2 source-based, 1 essay. 2 essays, 1 source-based. So I've just given you a brief overview pertaining the 4 topics that will come in as per se, basically. So learners, thank you very much for tuning in this afternoon, and good luck for tomorrow. Hope to see you next time again. Thank you. Bye.